stuff behind the scenes to make sure that it's all working and everything's set. But we believe that we're streaming where we're on, and so we're happy to be able to do that. We are going to follow up from Sunday morning where we discussed depression within the context of our larger sermon series that we've called Unwelcome Beliefs, where we're dealing specifically with mental health. And so we had a sermon just specifically dealing or addressing depression and what that may look like. And so that's what we're doing. We're going to follow up with that. And I think Doc has some jokes that he wants to share.
Yeah, one of the things that when you're going to talk about depression, the first thing you need to do is chuckle, right?
Everybody knows that. Yeah, it's a natural.
And so I went and found a site that had dark humor jokes. And some of these, I thought they were appropriate to start with. So, are you ready? Yep. Are you ready?
Yes.
My grief counselor died. He was so good, I didn't even care. How about this one? My mom died when we couldn't remember her blood type. As she died, she kept telling us, be positive, but it's hard without her. Here's one. My parents raised me as an only child. That'll cause depression. My parents raised me as an only child, which really messed up my sister.
Yeah, but if we met your sister, we'd understand why.
This is my daughter's. This is my daughter's favorite. I made a website for orphans. It doesn't have a homepage.
Oh, that's a tech joke and a.
It was elegant and disturbing at the same time.
And this one, because humans aren't the only ones that are depressed. When ordering food at a new restaurant, my wife asked the waiter what they do to prepare their chicken. Nothing special, he explained. We just tell them they're going to die.
Yeah.
And their brains are so small, I mean, they forget as soon as they hear it. It's still a surprise to them.
Just one more. I was drinking my Coke, and the waitress screamed, does anyone know CPR? I yelled, I know the whole alphabet. We all laughed and laughed, well, except one person.
That got dark real quick.
Yeah.
Well, it's a depression night, right?
Yeah. I really hope that your brother's listening and he chimes in with some comments about your sister. That'd be really great.
3 of them. I have 3 sisters.
Yeah, that's right. And the brothers, too. You were far from an only child.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But I saw myself as such.
Yeah.
In any case, we're doing this mental health series because we struggle. You know, one of the reasons that they selected me for depression is because they thought not only could I depress everybody, but I've battled it. And we talked a little bit about that on Sunday morning. It's something that is really, really common. For some people, it's like a way of life. For other people, it just crops up from time to time, circumstantially. There's a lot of different reasons. For some people, it's a biological. There's chemical imbalances, this sort of thing. For other people, they create neurological pathways in which they just choose a depressive response so often that it just becomes their norm. There's just a lot of different reasons. You know, sometimes it's circumstantial. Like I said, sometimes it's biological. Sometimes it's relational. You know, you can get into a depression when a really dear friend of yours leaves or abandons you or betrays you, or a marriage breaks up, or a problem with kids, a whole lot of different circumstances like that. And we also talked about, and this is something we don't always keep in mind, there's a spiritual dimension to depression. Because the fact is, even if there is not a spiritual cause, and there can be just a spiritual cause, but even if there is not, we do have spiritual enemies who want to mess us up. And depression is one of their tools. It's one of the things that they can do to drive in, and they'll ask you to, nudge you to believe some things that are just going to mess you over.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? And so this is a big deal, and perhaps we avoid it too much in church. We're going to tackle it. None of us is a psychologist or a psychotherapist. We are pastors, and we do think that Scripture has some things to say. And we also try to lean on very solid resources, people who know what they're doing from both a biblical perspective as well as a professional perspective. And so we'll try to talk about some of that stuff this evening.
And it is very relevant.
Go ahead.
Very well relevant, because statistically, it doesn't matter whose statistics you take, it's pretty well assumed that most people, at least once in their lifetime, if not many times, will experience what they would describe as depression. And it's something that you have to address or at least acknowledge. And I completely agree that while it may have chemical and other facets, it's a spiritual issue.
It rapidly becomes such. And one of the things I don't know how much we'll mention it, but when people are depressed, one of the things they tend to do is to push God away, and which
They tend to push everything away.
they do.
Even the relationships around them that would be bringing encouragement or spiritual context back to them.
Right. I've heard it described that your peripheral vision narrows in, and mentally and physically you only see a small portion of what's out there, and the rest of it you're unaware of.
That's a good descriptor. One of the things that one of the books that sometimes I use when I'm dealing with people who struggle with depression is called Feeling Good by a guy named Burns, and he approaches it from a perspective of what is called cognitive therapy. But basically, what he tells you is that when you're depressed, you don't see all of reality, and what you tend to do is you think you're the only one seeing reality and that nobody else understands. But what is happening actually is that molehills become mountains, small problems become giant problems. You don't have the perspective as you're talking about. You've got more of a tunnel vision. You think no one understands. You start to isolate from people. You start to isolate from God. And as I said earlier, all of this stuff is it's made worse by the advice of well-meaning people who oftentimes say stupid things, and it's made worse by spiritual enemies who like you where you are. And so this is a big issue. You guys got anything more before we move on to this stuff?
No,
Yeah.
Well, here are some of the big ideas that we had Sunday. Okay, we 2 or 3 things that we're going to start with, and then we'll blaze some new ground. We made the point that emotions are real, but they're not permanent. You feel an emotion, it's there, right? Sometimes it's not solid, and it certainly does not have to be permanent. That's the deal. Now, when we were studying this stuff, one of our preaching partners said, unless you make them so. Because you can take, an emotion isn't permanent, but you can feed it to the degree that it begins to define you. You don't challenge it, right? You create, as we have been talking about, those neural pathways. I'm going to respond this way. I do it so often that you get yourself in this big rut. Pretty soon, this emotion becomes almost God to you. It defines you, okay? But in reality, emotions are real, but they are not permanent. And one of the things that we talked about on Sunday morning is don't make permanent decisions based on temporary emotions. You feel bad. Don't go kill yourself. Right? You have a rough spot in your marriage. You don't like her much. Don't divorce her. Emotions are real, but they are temporary unless you make them permanent. Right? That was the first big point.
That takes me back to some teaching I got years ago from a counselor who was talking about reality and emotions. And they said emotions are reality. They are real. They are something that we all carry. But they're not the full story of reality, like what we've talked about. And she compared it to like a train. And oftentimes what happens is we take rationalism or logic away from our experience, and we let emotions drive where we're going. And so what happens is when we experience these emotions, we make them into something bigger than they ought to be, and then we make decisions off of those emotions like you're talking about, whereas what you have to do is you have to see that emotions need to be the thing that follows behind, that's attached to the back of the train. It's not the thing that's actually giving it power and directing it.
Exactly. One of the things we talked about on Sunday, we used the phrase emotions are not God. Emotions may pull one direction. God's going to pull the other direction. Okay? If we're Jesus followers, I don't care where your emotions are taking you. Radical obedience means that I'm going to do it God's way, even when my emotions are screaming to go a different way.
That's right. That's one of the indications of maturity.
Absolutely. And the second big point, your situation may seem hopeless, and that oftentimes feels that way. But if there really is a God who is all-powerful and all-wise, and a God who has a future prepared for you, the idea that you are hopeless is basically a denial of the existence of God and the power of God and the wisdom of God. If there's a God, you're not hopeless. You may be in a bad spot, but
Well,
there's always another side.
Yeah.
There's the other side of it.
yeah, you may authentically and deeply believe that things are hopeless, just absolutely so. But emotions can so often be misleading, wrong, inappropriate, and we tend to put so much trust in emotions. And I question that they deserve that much
Yeah,
trust.
we're in love with them in our culture, and we cannot be. That's emotions. You live by your emotions, you're going to live a messed up life. Bottom line.
If you flip, one of the things that we regularly talk about is some of the philosophies of the atheist perspective, and typically we talk about how there's an emptiness to that kind of a thinking or belief system because there isn't anything beyond what is, right? We've often, in that talking, kind of almost in jest, we've talked about how it would be depressing to become an atheist or to be an atheist because you lack the hope. Again, as we're speaking specifically as pastors and we're speaking predominantly to a Christian group of people who are listening, the fact that you believe in the God provides the sense that there is a hope beyond what you're currently experiencing. And again, things get so big that we just block all that out and we forget. We get
Yes.
that narrow vision like you're talking about and we just lose it.
If you like philosophical terms, what you're talking about, because I have always made the case that if there wasn't a God, the most coherent way to live is what's called nihilism. Nothing matters, you don't matter, I don't matter, who cares? And
depression makes a whole lot of sense in that system.
it
Yes,
really
it
does.
does.
Yeah.
Now, we talked about some strategies as well. And one of the first strategies we talk about is that you have to have what we call ruthless honesty, both with yourself and with God, right? Be honest. Now, we use the example of Jeremiah, who I mentioned as my favorite prophet because he's the grumpiest prophet. He's one of my kindred spirits. But bottom line, Jeremiah, he took his frustrations, his confusions, his anger right to God instead of away from him like what we usually do. Let me talk to
Right.
somebody about what I think about God. We'll go talk to God. That's what he did, right? And he was ruthlessly honest. He named the emotions he was feeling. He went straight to God. And there's wisdom in his approach. It's one of the things that kind of makes us uncomfortable sometimes to read passages like those written by Jeremiah or some of the Psalms or Job, and some of the other places you find in the Bible. But these guys were honest, and they went straight to God instead of away from God. Number two, we said you got to admit that you need help. Admitting you need help is not weakness, which is what a lot of guys perceive it as. It's wisdom. The fact is you're not experiencing anything that others haven't experienced before you, and there are people who have found ways through it.
Right.
And not to lean on their wisdom is foolishness.
Well, you remember there was the book and movie The Catch-22, the idea that there's a mechanism in place that's going to frustrate your doing anything positive about a situation. I think I said that correctly. It sounds good to me. And it's the same thing, I'm told, with depression, that it has mechanisms or characteristics that automatically keep you from being able to address it positively. For instance, asking for help. And I think that goes beyond just societies also. It's a part of the psychosis, as they would say. And I also think that it takes a particularly strong, confident person or man to be able to ask for help.
Absolutely, I agree.
We talked about that some last week.
You got any more on that, Ben?
I'm looking at these, and obviously these are strategies against depression. And so I think that the flip side of this, you can look and say depression often encourages us to do the opposite. So when it comes to ruthless honesty, in depressive episodes, you don't really want to be honest about what you're feeling or experiencing. And so ruthless honesty completely combats the spot that you're in. Admitting you need help. Oftentimes you want to try to convince yourself that you're okay, that this is normal, that there's anything wrong with you, any of those kinds of things.
Or
it's
that
complete
nobody
opposite.
understands except you.
Nobody needs help. Yeah, nobody can help me. Nobody's going to understand. Nobody can connect, right? And then the idea of staying connected to God's people. We've already mentioned that. There's this temptation, whether anxiety or depression. We've talked about this now a couple weeks. When we get into those episodes, we tend to push everything away and we isolate. And when we do that, it becomes just that self-fulfilling prophecy becomes that spiral because it just feeds into itself.
Drives it deeper.
Yeah.
Yes.
A couple of other strategies we talked about. Number one, keep pursuing God. Because again, as you mentioned, Ben, you're going to be tempted to do exactly the opposite. When you're depressed, you tend to isolate. You isolate from people. You tend to isolate from God, right? Pull in. And it's a strategy that simply makes it deeper, makes it harder. I also use the phrase, preach to yourself. And the reason I use this is that when you're in the middle of a depression, as you mentioned, Ben, all you see is this thin slice of reality. You got to keep telling yourself this is not all there is. Okay? It looks dark. You got to tell yourself there's a God.
Yes.
It looks like it's hopeless. You got to tell yourself with God it's never hopeless. And we looked it up in Jeremiah where he's talking, but I tell myself, right? And he reminds himself of who God is and what God has done and of God's faithfulness and of God's goodness. And sometimes you have to preach to yourself to counter the little lies, the narrowing that is taking place in your depression.
Oh, absolutely.
And then the last one I talked about was radical obedience, which means essentially, as we've already said, you don't follow your feelings. You follow God,
You just keep
even
doing
when
the
you
right
don't like him.
Yeah.
And you notice, speaking of Jeremiah, that when you take these embarrassing, shameful, whatever problems to God, he does not demean you for it. He doesn't criticize you. He just jumps in with both arms to help.
Well, the fact is, if you hide it, you're not hiding it from God.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea that somehow you can keep something back from God is just stupidity, right? And so he already knows it, so you might as well get honest with him.
Yeah.
You got anything more, guys? No. Let's move on. Now, what I'm going to do here is kind of turn the corner a little bit and just break some new ground, because when I was thinking about what to do this evening, I wanted to make sure we were giving some good, solid material on this kind of stuff. So I dug around a little bit and found an article by Cru, which used to be Campus Crusade for Christ, okay, on how to face depression as a Christian. And as I read through it, pretty solid stuff. Okay, and so I thought we'd just reflect on some of the things that were spoken about in that article. Okay, you don't have to agree with all of it. I don't. Okay, but it's still a pretty good walkthrough, and we'll talk about those places where maybe it can be modified a wee bit, and just keep in mind that they're probably right and I'm not. But I push back a lot. Yeah, yeah.
But go ahead.
They talked about some misconceptions, and then they talked about reality. One misconception is depression is not real. Reality is depression is real. It's an illness that impacts the brain's ability to function as it should. Now, whether there's a biological motivation, a relational motivation, whether it's going to be some kind of a circumstantial cause, it still causes thinking to get clouded. Does that make sense? Yeah.
And it can be simply thinking, because we don't all always think correctly or effectively or efficiently. We can have all sorts of misunderstandings and mistakes. So depression can simply be a fault in the way that you're thinking. And all that it takes to change that is to change your thinking.
Yeah.
And I think there's a reason why we've got to say this, because unfortunately, within the church, there's been a lot of Christians over the years who have acted as if depression is not real and have actually been discouraging to their brothers and sisters in Christ who are struggling. And that's why some of these points are worth saying out loud and letting people hear. This is a real thing. We're not making this up. This isn't us just giving into culture and going along with the flow of what's happening. This is us addressing real things.
Well, if you remember here in Kentucky, 20 years ago, there was that shooting in downtown Louisville. And the fellow who did the shooting, somebody came up with the explanation or alibi for him to use in court was that he was taking Prozac, and Prozac made him crazy and dangerous. And after that, you still hear periodically where, for instance, in discussions about gun violence and the such, that if people are depressed, they risk of violence to others, and that's a myth. You may be a danger to yourself, but taking medication that's prescribed for a mental illness is not going to drive you to mass murder.
Here's another misconception that they talked about. Depression is a sin. Their comment was that depression is an illness, not a sin. One variation that they mentioned is being depressed means you're failing to trust God. Being depressed means you're failing to embrace joy or give thanks to God. Okay? And I think in most cases, or in many cases, depression is not a sin. I'm not sure I would say it's always not a sin, because there are different kinds of depression and different levels of depression and different. I can remember some of us get really, really depressed when Oregon loses. And if you can break up a marriage over that, I suspect there's some sinning taking place. I remember one time it almost broke the faith of a lady on TV, one of our TV preachers, when her dog died and she prayed for it to come back to life and it wouldn't. And it almost shattered her faith in God. This is real. I'm not making this up.
Wow.
Okay, now this was many years ago before you were born. But the fact is, it made national news.
Catherine Kuhlman would have been all over that.
So in any case,
No idea who that is.
that's silliness. Okay, now there are sometimes we get depressed. Oh no, that person is wearing the same shoes that I am. Or, oh my, I burnt the toast. Now, it is possible that in depression, these things can become mountainous. But sometimes people are catalyzed by things that they should brush by. That's what I want to point out, because when we talk about magnanimity and grace, sometimes we get depressed over things that, if we are healthy, we will blow off. If we are healthy, we will forgive. Now, that doesn't mean that there are not things so big, so catalytic that they can drive you into a depression. And depression, driven by big causes, is not sin. What you do with it can be sin. Okay? Yeah. I think that's the distinction. Even on these little things that you get depressed over, I suppose feeling annoyed because Oregon got beat again doesn't mean that you can feel bad, but if I use that in order to, how I respond to that can become sin. All right? And so there are levels of depression. There are some things that catalyze depression that I think are wussy. And there are things that catalyze depression that are major. Feeling depression is not a sin. What comes next may or may not be. Now, that's my modification. I don't know if you guys would agree. Would you, Ben?
Yes and no. I think that there's a sense in which there's still this illness aspect to it. Some of your notes, you mentioned like the cold or the flu or a COVID. I mean, sometimes you can't control the things that you catch, and sometimes it's even the things you catch are really small and insignificant. I do think that there are times when we fall in love with our emotions. And we talked about that earlier. And not the good emotions, sometimes it's the bad emotions. I think just personally, I can say that I think bitterness is one of the more appealing emotions because there's something self-satisfactory about it, right? Like it's easy to appreciate or enjoy something that isn't healthy and right. And I think there's a sense in which depression can be that. And I think sometimes there's almost a decision to be depressed,
yes,
as opposed to the struggle with the sickness, if that makes sense. And I think that's where you start getting into levels of appropriateness, or you start getting into where it would become actually something that is contrary to God.
Well, I was just reflecting on my own battles from time to time. Okay, I've had two of the big spiritual battles that I've had to fight. Right. I mentioned Sunday morning when I got fired from the college, right? Now, the last thing in the world I wanted to do, even when God called me into ministry, was to be a preacher, right? And when I got here, I began to realize I hated being here as a pastor. And then I kept on getting convicted by the Apostle Paul when he said, I have learned to be content. Which means it wasn't a simple thing, but it was between him and God to learn to be content. Mm-hmm. And so I set it as a goal to try to learn to be content, and was annoyed when I got there.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, I didn't mind being a pastor.
Because God didn't shift his perspective. You've shifted your
He
perspective.
made me
Is that
shift
what it was?
mine.
Yeah.
But that was a spiritual battle going on in me, and that was there was some darkness in my heart in that. Okay, on my response to it. And then what I began to realize a few years later is that, okay, it's one thing to be content. That wasn't God's goal for me. God wants us to taste joy. Mm-hmm. And I can be content without being joyful. Mm-hmm. And I began to realize that my resistance to joy was also sinful.
Yeah, because
now,
you can make that
I'm just
choice.
reflecting on my own responses, because I had some good causes to be depressed. All right? Mm-hmm. On the other hand, my responses were not always God-honoring. Sometimes the things that I've gotten depressed over are not God-honoring. Mm-hmm. In fact, I think some depression today is almost faddish. It's almost a fad to get depressed over something, and so you're depressed and you can be excused for nonsense.
Yes.
It's become a buzzword that people can over dramatize.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so depression is real. Mm-hmm. Okay. Some depression is blown out of control, and how we respond to depression can be God honoring or not. I think those are just some of the things that I was reflecting on as we were going through this. I hope it's not hurting anybody, but that's where it was. The next one, next misconception they talked about, depression will go away if you pray hard enough or if you have enough faith.
Heard that before. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, it probably depends on, like you were saying, there's almost a spectrum of depression where some of it is, at one end, is not a sin. It's a serious illness to be dealt with. The other end of the spectrum, it's something trivial that people use to manipulate others or get their way.
Oregon lost a football game, and Doc needs to take a moment and pray and confess to God and get over it.
Right. And not
Is that
expect.
fair?
I spent a lot of time in prayer.
Right. But if you do spend time in prayer, it is, I would think, likely to be beneficial with that type of, or that end of the spectrum that's trivial, that's self-created.
Yeah, things that we should be getting over real quickly.
Yeah, right.
The temptation can get there, but don't let it hang. Right. Now, once it becomes an illness, okay, let's talk about real illness. If your kid breaks an arm, you don't pray about it.
Yeah.
Only.
I hope you take them to a doctor, and I hope they do some doctor stuff to mend it.
Some doctoring.
Right? As with any illness, professional help is oftentimes called for. Mm-hmm. When it's a trivial thing, get over it. Right. Turns into depression. It becomes an issue. God is capable of intervening in a variety of ways. He doesn't just heal our minds, just like he doesn't always just heal our bodies. In fact, would be odd, unusual. Normally, he uses doctors, he uses meds, he uses counselors, he uses a whole variety of tools to help people heal. Okay? And so just to say it'll pray hard enough, you're not going to have enough faith, that just causes people to close up.
And to make use of medicine, doctors, and so on is not an indication of a lack of faith on your part.
No.
And like you say, you would want to pray and whatever else is appropriate along with it.
Yeah. Next misconception. Some people think that depression is a punishment from God. Okay? Variation of this, if you have depression, you must have some unconfessed sin. This is an old one. This goes back to the time of the New Testament. My illness is because of my sin. And Jesus challenged this. Depression is not the fault of the person who is suffering, unless you're just stupid, right? It is a difficult trial that can refine faith, but it is not a punishment for sin. To think of it as a punishment for sin, listen, I heard this one time, I think it was Steve Brown. He said, God's already paid for your sin. Jesus did that on the cross. God doesn't punish you for the same sin twice.
Mhm.
Jesus has taken that punishment. Okay?
I've often thought that that approach, for someone to say your condition is because of an unconfessed sin or something horrible that you've done, that's really my way of protecting myself against what you're suffering. If I can say that you created some sin and that's it, I can feel
It
safer to myself.
absolves you of personal responsibility.
Right, which is ridiculous.
Ben, you got anything on that one?
I was just thinking, I think sometimes depression may be the consequences of my sin,
That's true.
but that doesn't mean that that's God punishing me for my sin.
That's a good-
Sometimes we've got consequences for our sin, regardless of. God doesn't have to step in and twist scenarios in the world to make us pay for sin. Sometimes what we do is enough that we have to suffer as it is, and again, that can lead to depression as well.
You got it. That's a good caveat. Next one, misperception. Depression is an excuse for laziness or not doing your Christian duty. Variation.
I've heard that.
Okay? Some people say, well, you're letting God or your church down if you're too depressed to serve or to minister.
Well, is that true of other illnesses?
Well, that's the deal. Okay?
That's a
Depression.
really good comment.
Depression, sometimes, if it's a wussy depression, it can be an excuse for laziness or not doing
Yeah.
your duty.
Yeah.
But if we're talking about
Lazy
serious
people are really
depression,
good at excuses for why they're lazy.
but the fact is, depression can be debilitating. It can make it very difficult. And the fact is, God's going to love you no matter how much you serve Him. You might have a time where you're in a valley. God's not keeping score.
Yeah.
And so on that sort of thing. And so, but on the other side of it is, okay, I know that depression makes it harder to serve. However, when you're dealing with somebody who is battling depression, one of the strategies that you try to use is to get them to serve somewhere.
We
To
talked
live
about
out-
that last week with anxiety.
You live outside yourself. The fact is, as long as you're not doing anything, you're all just absorbed in yourself. You're focusing on yourself. You're focusing on your issues, your problems, your pain, right?
Yep.
On the other hand, you start to serve, you begin to live outside of yourself. Live for something more than yourself, something bigger than yourself. And one of the most powerful things you can do as a kind of a medicine when you're depressed is to start serving in some way. Okay? It'll be hard, be really, really hard, but sometimes medicine doesn't taste good.
And it may not feel right, but once again, you shouldn't rely on your feelings in these cases.
You got it. Now, I'm going to go pretty quickly here. Misperception, conception. People with depression are unstable, cannot be trusted with church leadership or responsibilities. Variation. Some people say it this way. Depression is an indication of unconfessed sin or weak faith, so people with depression are not fit for leadership.
Yeah.
I talked to one person who said that their pastor admitted confession in 3 months. He was fired.
Admitted depression, yeah.
And I asked, is that because I admitted depression on Sunday? And my question was, that gives me until October.
Yeah. It wasn't so much a story from the past, it was telling the future.
The fact is, depression and other mental illnesses do not disqualify people from leadership. Okay? In fact, sometimes people who have experienced depression have a compassion and a perspective that can make them excellent leaders. They've been there, felt that. And the fact is, if you go back in history, some of the greatest Christian leaders have battled with depression. I mentioned people like Martin Luther and Charles Spurgeon, right?
Abraham Lincoln.
There you go. You look at the stats are that pastors tend to battle depression about twice the level of those who are not pastors.
I think we're hitting around kind of a big idea here. I think that it's actually very frequent that leaders will experience depression. Being in a position of leadership means that things won't always go the way that you want them to. People are going to have needs that you can't always meet. People who you think are part of the team or following you are going to push back or make your life difficult. I mean, there's so many pitfalls and challenges to being in a position of leadership, any sort of leadership, that it's going to be easy to feel all of those different emotions that would push you towards depression. And so I think I think what we're really saying is that whether Christian or unchristian, non-Christian, that being in positions of leadership make you probably more vulnerable to depression.
If nothing else, you are exposed as a leader to much more of the brokenness in people around you than the rest of the people around you.
You are.
And I'll also reverse it. Imagine a leader who has zero struggle or concern about depression. That sounds like a psychopath, right?
Pretty close, yeah.
if they don't have any emotions that take a toll on them for leading, they're
Right.
probably a terrifying person.
Right, it has to do with empathy. Psychopaths and sociopaths, to a lesser degree, are unable to empathize with others. It's kind of at the heart of it. And as a minister or as a leader in general, you have to have some degree of appropriate, effective empathy in order to understand the environment you're leading.
Yeah, I agree.
Let's go to the next misconception. Misconception: it is shameful to discuss mental illness openly. Reality: of all places, the church community should be the safest environment for people to discuss mental health without judgment. Do you buy that, guys?
No.
Okay.
I think that there is still a need to be, I'll say, discreet. You don't want to just broadcast to everybody who's
got it.
earshot that, I have this problem or that. You need to have some discretion because statistically there are going to be people around you who don't understand.
That's going to go to this next couple
good
of
perspective,
misconceptions, okay? Because I think that this one's here going to be modified a little bit by what's coming.
That word "openly," I think, is a significant word. I like. Now, again, I would go with the reality. The church community should be a safe environment for people to discuss mental health without judgment.
Yes.
The idea that you just broadcast that everywhere is maybe not.
It's not
Completely healthy.
And I'll hold on for about two misconceptions. This next one is not it. Misconception: you can always tell if someone is depressed by their outward appearances or actions. That's a misconception. Okay. Reality: our masks are very good. A lot of people who are depressed are really, really good at masks. I mentioned that on Sunday morning. I am great with masks, and it's my job. My job as a pastor, it's to be an encourager, a comforter. It's to try to bring joy. Yeah. Even if I'm not feeling it, it doesn't change my responsibilities before God. Mm-hmm. All right?
Yeah. The majority of the time when you find out someone's depressed, you don't respond with, "Yeah, I knew that." Most of the time it's a shock and a surprise.
Well, think of all the TV interviews where they interview the neighbor who says, "Oh, he was never like that." You'd never think that about them.
I think of Robin Williams. And
yes,
and who he was.
Another one. Okay, this is where I was kind of getting back to what you were talking about, Ben. It's okay to talk about another person's depression or struggles with mental illness as long as they don't know. Okay? A variation of this: sharing someone's struggles about mental illness without their knowledge lets other people know they need to be sensitive. Let's pray for them.
Yeah. No,
let's put them on our prayer list.
Churches are good at gossiping through the prayer list.
I was going to say, that's just gossip with some lipstick on it.
Here's the deal. When people share their mental health concerns, it's like what we say in our life groups. What happens in life group stays in life group.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There's a confidence that you anticipate, a confidentiality that you anticipate. They should be respected and held in confidence. It is gossip to talk about someone's mental health behind their backs. And a variation of what you said, just don't tell everybody, because a lot of people are going to give you stupid advice. Mm-hmm. Choose your counselors wisely. Yeah. You want to go to a mature Christian, to a mature friend, to a mature family member, right? To a mature counselor, good God-honoring counselor, because you can get terrible advice about depression from nearly everybody.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, you guys got anything more on that one? Okay. This is their list. I gave the strategies in my sermon on the things that you do when you're battling depression. This is their list. Okay? Remember, number one, that you are not cut off from God, which is good. It's a good point, right? God doesn't stop loving you when you're depressed, when you're struggling to embrace His joy. God still loves you, right? You're not alone. A whole lot of people like you, and the fact is there are people around you who still care for you. You may not feel that way. You may feel entirely isolated. But God loves you, and there are good people who still care for you.
Who can help?
Who can help. You're exactly right. Third thing, which is related, God's love and God's faithfulness never depend on you.
That's such a powerful
Isn't it?
statement.
Yeah.
That's so significant. And that's for anybody. That's for anyone dealing with sin, anyone dealing with mental health issues, anyone dealing with physical health issues, anyone dealing with relational issues. That's a huge, huge statement.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Next one, they say, God can bring good even out of something as painful as depression. I think I used the phrase, or you used the phrase, God doesn't waste a hurt. That was from Rick Warren. 2 Corinthians talks about the fact that oftentimes you go through a struggle and God can use you to comfort others who are going through the same struggle, right? God can use them to shape you. God can use them to use you. Both ways, okay? Next point they point out is that there is still hope because your low thoughts and emotions are not the truth. You're seeing this narrow piece, okay? There is a bigger picture. You have to keep preaching to yourself, right? Next thing they mention is you can find strength by leaning on community, which is not what you're going to want to do.
And
Two more.
That
Go ahead.
strength is also going to include a correct interpretation of reality.
Yes, exactly right, Ben.
I have had a few friends with depression, and one of them described to me how when he was feeling suicidal, he would think very clearly to himself that if I were to take my life, that would be okay because my family and friends would understand I'm no longer suffering. They'd be happy for me. And to truly believe that says something about how disconnected from reality you can be. But if you're in a community of believers, they're going to help address that.
You got it. Another one is your family and friends can help you. Now be careful again, because your family and friends can also mess you up. Okay, so be careful, but don't pull away from people. That's the big point. And their last point is it is perfectly appropriate, wise often, to seek professional help. Whether that be a pastor, guys like us who don't know a whole lot, right? Whether it be a counselor, a psychologist, psychiatrist, as long as in my mind they're God-honoring. I think that guys who are not God-honoring can still do damage. I look for a good, solid Christian counselor. I like to start there.
Well, there isn't a downside to that. If you were to suspect you needed help and went to a professional, a legitimate professional, worst case, they're going to say, no, you're okay. This is no big deal. Well, here's how you handle it. Nice to meet you. Goodbye. So there isn't a downside to seeking serious, competent professional help.
And again, even that, we're still talking about something on a spectrum. You know, sometimes we think you go to a professional, it means that you're going there just to be able to get pills or whatever else. Sometimes it's counseling. Sometimes it's saying this is what you're feeling. Here's appropriate ways to deal with it and address it and be able to move forward. There's even a spectrum of responses in that are healthy.
Yes.
One of the things that stands out to me in this list that you just gave of things to remember, for those of you who are watching and who are maybe not one who specifically struggles with depression, that's not your specific issue, these are good things to know to help the people around you. And that's just a little bit of a plug of what we're going to be talking about this upcoming Sunday, because it's not always, you know, the level of struggle of depression in my life, I would say, is fairly minimal. I've had my tough moments, I've had my low spots, but it's not the kind of thing that grips me or holds me. But I've got a lot of people in my life that I care and love deeply who I know struggle with these kinds of things. And so it's wise for me to know what those valuable remembering things. Sometimes it can be me that helps people remember these things to be able to hold on to. And I think that's really significant.
Yeah. You had mentioned earlier about the appearance, and somebody who is seriously dealing with depression isn't necessarily gothic looking or somehow obvious. There's a thing called high functioning depression, where you look just like everybody else. So when it comes to your friends, your family, neighbors, and so on, I think there's some wisdom in looking and just kind of wondering, is there something I'm missing here, without starting a witch hunt or some such thing.
In fact, some people put on the depressed because they want strokes.
Yes.
But in any case, I have one more thing because you guys are trying to make me overtime.
Yep, it was too early. I had to get you over.
Yeah.
When you talk about preaching to yourself, there are a couple of verses that I think they're incredibly important. And you're not going to feel this. You're going to have a hard time believing it, right? But just a suggestion, when you talk about radical obedience, it means you do it God's way even when you don't agree with Him, understand Him, like it.
Mm-hmm.
Paul says, finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, noble, right, pure, lovely, admirable, excellent, or praiseworthy, obsess over those things.
Mm-hmm.
You create new neural pathways. Okay? Battle the old neural pathways. It's worth a shot, right?
Well, that's how the brain
Rather
and
than
nervous
just giving
system
in.
work. That's the way that the brain and nervous system work.
Yeah.
Is they can they're plastique. They can change.
And if you're stuck in the Old Testament, Deuteronomy 31:8, the Lord Himself goes before you. He will be with you. He will never leave or forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. He's saying that because we are prone to be both. Mm-hmm. We're prone to be discouraged. We're prone to be afraid. Yeah. Okay? We're prone to push God away. And it's just this encouragement. Keep preaching to yourself these things. Okay? Mm-hmm. And I think those are a couple of pretty solid verses to end with. So, Ben, wrap us up.
All right, we've got some quick announcements to let you know. First of all, tomorrow is Jessica Breidert's birthday, and you need to make a big deal about that.
Mm-hmm.
Celebrate her, honk, drive by her house, do whatever you
She
have to
wanted
do.
Jessica Breidert month.
Yeah, it has been her month, but she wants as much attention as possible. So just do anything you can to bring attention to her. The Friday night, we've got our block party back behind the church at the party shed. We have live music. It's from 6 to 8. Free food, live music. It's going to be a good time. Make sure you're there for that. Saturday morning, we have our men's breakfast, 7:30 as usual. And Sunday, our staycation is Ice Cream Sunday. So make sure you come in for that, ready to eat ice cream in the AM. I have always thought that if you're eating ice cream in the AM, then you're probably unhealthy or depressed.
No, it's a good day. and if you're talking about healing people and having ice cream the same day, that's one of the greatest catalysts for healing.
Heal some people with some ice cream.
That's one of the times decadency is a good thing.
Okay, I don't know.
There you go.
All right, and then here in a couple weeks, we're going to be starting up a new sermon series called One Another's. You'll get a little preview of that Sunday morning that we're both really excited about. And so just keep those things on your radar. We're so very glad that you guys joined us tonight. Thank you for being here with us, and we look forward to seeing you Sunday.
Good night.